Arthur Whitaker was a man who had everything: money, power, and a life most people could only dream of. His penthouse in Manhattan overlooked the glittering city skyline, where lights danced like stars on the streets below. But for Arthur, those lights felt cold and distant these days. They reminded him of what he'd lost, a part of himself, and worse, a piece of his little girl's happiness. Emily, his 8-year-old daughter, sat in her wheelchair by the window every evening, staring at the same view. She didn't say much anymore. Once full of laughter and curiosity, she now seemed trapped, not just physically but emotionally too. It broke Arthur's heart more than anything else ever had, and it was all his fault. A year ago, Arthur had been rushing to an important business meeting. He'd promised himself he wouldn't miss this one. It was a deal that would seal his legacy as one of the richest men in the country. So when the phone rang reminding him how late he already was, he sped through the rainy streets without thinking twice. That decision changed everything. The car skidded on the wet road, spinning, out of control. Emily, sitting quietly in the back seat, screamed as the vehicle slammed into a lamppost. Arthur walked away with bruises and guilt, but Emily wasn't so lucky. The doctors told him she'd never walk again. Paralyzed from the waist down, they said. No amount of money or influence could undo the damage. Since then, Arthur had tried everything modern medicine offered. He flew specialists from around the world to see her, spent millions on experimental treatments, and even built a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center in her name. But nothing worked. Emily stayed in her wheelchair, growing quieter with each passing day. Her once bright eyes dimmed and her smile became rare, almost foreign. One bitterly cold winter night, Arthur stood alone on his balcony, sipping whiskey and watching the snow fall over the city. He hated this time of year. It reminded him of the crash, of the accident, of the life he couldn't fix no matter how hard he tried. His mind wandered to Emily, asleep inside, and the weight of his failure pressed heavily on his chest. Just as he turned to go back inside, a voice crackled over the intercom near the gate downstairs. It startled him. Visitors weren't common at this hour. Through the speaker came the sound of a young boy's voice, trembling slightly against the wind. "Sir, I need to talk to you." Arthur frowned. Who could possibly be here at this time? The security guard stationed outside must have missed something. He leaned closer to the monitor and saw a figure huddled beneath the flickering street lamp. A boy, no older than 14, stood there barefoot in the snow, clutching what looked like a crumpled flyer. His clothes were ragged, patched together like scraps of old blankets, and his face was smudged with dirt. "What do you want?" Arthur asked sharply, his tone harsher than intended. He wasn't in the mood for interruptions, especially not from some homeless kid. "Sir," the boy repeated, undeterred by Arthur's coldness. "I can make your daughter walk again." Arthur froze. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard. Make Emily walk again? This scrawny, unkempt child standing in the snow thought he could undo what countless doctors and scientists had failed to achieve. "Get out of here," Arthur snapped, anger rising in his chest. "This isn't funny." But the boy didn't budge. Instead, he held up the flyer he'd been holding. Arthur recognized it immediately. It was from a charity event he'd organized months ago to raise funds for spinal injury research. Emily's picture was on it, smiling brightly in her wheelchair. How did this boy even get hold of it? "I'm serious, sir," the boy insisted, his voice steady despite the biting cold. "I know things others don't, things about healing. Let me help her." Arthur hesitated. Part of him wanted to yell at the guard to chase the boy away, to dismiss him as a desperate con artist looking for a meal or a warm place to sleep. But another part, the part deep inside that still clung to hope, stopped him. What if this boy really knew something? What if there was even the slightest chance he could help Emily? Against his better judgment, Arthur buzzed the boy in. As the gates creaked open, he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight might change everything or nothing at all. Either way, he knew he'd regret it if he turned the boy away. And so, with a mixture of skepticism, desperation, and a tiny spark of hope, Arthur welcomed the stranger into his home. Little did he No, this decision would set off a chain of events that would challenge everything he believed in and redefine what truly mattered in life. The boy stepped inside, leaving muddy footprints on the marble floor. Arthur cringed inwardly at the mess but said nothing. The kid looked even smaller and more fragile under the bright lights of the mansion. His clothes were patched together, with threadbare fabric, and his hands were rough and calloused, as if they'd done years of hard labor far beyond his age. His face was smudged with dirt, but his eyes, those sharp, piercing eyes, seemed to see right through Arthur. There was something unnerving about them, like they carried secrets too heavy for a child to bear. Arthur gestured toward the living room without a word. The boy followed silently, clutching the crumpled flyer in his hand like it was some kind of treasure. Once inside, Arthur pointed to a chair across from him. "Sit," he said curtly, his tone still laced with suspicion. The boy obeyed, perching awkwardly on the edge of the expensive leather seat, clearly uncomfortable in such an opulent setting. "So," Arthur began, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "Who are you, and what makes you think you can help my daughter?" The boy hesitated for a moment, glancing around the room as if taking in the grandeur of the place before speaking. Then, with surprising calmness, he said, "I don't have a name that matters here, but I know things. Old ways of healing. My grandmother taught me." "Your grandmother?" Arthur raised an eyebrow, skepticism dripping from his voice. "What does she have to do with this?" "She was a healer," the boy explained simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "She helped people when doctors couldn't. Before she passed away, she showed me how to use herbs, touch, and words to fix what's broken." Arthur let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Herbs? Words? You're telling me you can cure paralysis? With plants and chants?" The boy didn't flinch at Arthur's sarcasm. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto Arthur's. "You don't believe in miracles, sir," he said softly, almost sadly. "But your daughter does." Something about those words struck a chord deep within Arthur. He sat back, his jaw tightening. Was this kid mocking him, or was there truth behind his strange confidence? Either way, Arthur couldn't deny the flicker of curiosity or desperation that stirred in his chest. "All right," Arthur said finally, standing up. "Let's say I humor you. What exactly do you plan to do?" "I need to meet her first," the boy replied, rising to his feet as well. "If she agrees, I'll show you." Arthur hesitated. Letting this scruffy stranger near Emily felt reckless, maybe even dangerous. But then again, what did he have to lose? Every doctor, every treatment, every experimental procedure had failed. What harm could come from letting this boy try? "Fine," Arthur muttered reluctantly. "But if this is some kind of trick—" "It's not," the boy interrupted firmly, cutting off Arthur mid-sentence. "I promise." Emily was in her room when Arthur knocked gently on the door. She looked up. From the book she'd been pretending to read, her expression blank. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice soft and hesitant. "Hey, sweetheart," Arthur said, forcing a smile. "There's someone I want you to meet. He says he might be able to help you." Emily's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't say anything. Arthur stepped aside to let the boy enter. For a moment, the two of them just stared at each other, the small, frail girl in her wheelchair and the equally small, scruffy boy standing awkwardly by the door. "Hi," the boy said finally, breaking the silence. "My name doesn't matter, but I'm here to help you." Emily tilted her head, studying him curiously. "How can you help me?" she asked, her voice tinged with both hope and doubt. "I'll explain later," the boy replied with a faint smile. "For now, can I sit with you?" Emily glanced at Arthur, who gave a slight nod of approval. The boy pulled up a chair beside her and placed his hands lightly on her legs. Arthur watched uneasily from the doorway, unsure of what to expect. Was this some kind of performance? A cheap parlor trick? But then something unexpected happened. Emily gasped softly, her eyes widening in surprise. "Daddy!" she exclaimed, looking up at Arthur. "It feels funny." "What feels funny?" Arthur asked, stepping closer. My legs, Emily said, her voice trembling with excitement. They feel tingly, like pins and needles. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. Could it be possible? No, it had to be her imagination or maybe just wishful thinking. Still, he couldn't ignore the look of pure wonder on her face. The boy removed his hands and smiled at Emily. That's a good sign, he said confidently. We'll start tomorrow. Later that night, after the boy had been shown to a spare bedroom, Arthur paced back and forth in his study. His mind raced with questions. Who was this kid? Where had he come from? And why did he seem so certain he could do what no one else could? He poured himself another drink and sank into his chair, staring at the empty fireplace. Part of him wanted to dismiss the whole thing as nonsense, a desperate attempt by a homeless boy to scam a wealthy man. But another part, the part that had seen the spark of joy return to Emily's eyes, couldn't shake the feeling that there was something extraordinary about this boy. As he sat there lost in thought, Arthur heard a soft knock on the door. It was Emily peeking in shyly. "Daddy?" she whispered. "Yes, sweetheart," Arthur replied, setting his glass down. "I like him," Emily said simply. "He makes me feel hopeful." Arthur sighed, running a hand over his face. Hope was a dangerous thing. It could lift you higher than any mountain or crush you beneath its weight. Yet, looking at Emily's earnest expression, he realized he couldn't take that away from her. Not yet. "All right," Arthur said quietly, pulling her into a hug. "We'll give him a chance." The next morning, the boy appeared in the dining room, dressed in clean clothes that Arthur had provided. He ate quietly, his movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring every bite. When he finished, he looked up at Arthur and nodded. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "Now let's begin." Arthur led him to a spacious room on the ground floor that had been converted into a therapy area. It was equipped with everything modern medicine offered, exercise machines, parallel bars, massage tables, but none of it had worked. As they entered, Emily wheeled herself in eagerly, her cheeks flushed with anticipation. The boy knelt beside her and reached into a small pouch he'd brought with him. From it, he pulled out a handful of dried leaves and crushed them between his fingers, releasing a faint, earthy aroma. Then, without explanation, he began rubbing the mixture onto Emily's legs, his touch gentle yet firm. "What is that?" Arthur asked, frowning. "It's an old remedy," the boy replied without looking up. "It helps awaken the body." Arthur crossed his arms, watching skeptically as the boy continued his work. Despite his doubts, he couldn't deny the sense of calm that seemed to fill the room. Even Emily appeared relaxed, her usual tension melting away under the boy's careful ministrations. After finishing with the herbs, the boy placed his hands on her legs once more and closed his eyes. For several minutes he remained perfectly still, his breathing slow and rhythmic. Arthur shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to make of this bizarre ritual. Finally, the boy opened his eyes and smiled at Emily. "You're stronger than you think," he told her. "Remember that." Emily nodded, her lips curling into a tentative smile. "Okay," she whispered. Over the next hour, the boy guided Emily through a series of exercises, encouraging her to imagine herself walking again. At first, Arthur thought it sounded ridiculous. How could imagining something change reality? But as he watched Emily's face light up with determination, he began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than met the eye. By the end of the session, Emily was exhausted but happy. "That was fun," she exclaimed, grinning at her father. Arthur forced a smile, though his mind was still reeling. Whether this boy was a miracle worker or a clever fraud, one thing was clear. He had reignited a spark in Emily that Arthur hadn't seen in months, and for now that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and the boy's presence in the Whitaker household became a strange kind of routine. Every morning, he would appear in the therapy room with his small pouch of herbs and a quiet confidence that seemed to grow stronger. Each day, Emily greeted him eagerly, her excitement palpable as she wheeled herself into the room. Arthur, on the other hand, remained skeptical, but couldn't bring himself to stop the sessions. Something about the boy's methods, however unorthodox, was undeniably captivating. The treatments themselves were unlike anything Arthur had ever seen. The boy used a mix of ancient practices and simple exercises, often combining them in ways that made no logical sense to Arthur's analytical mind. He crushed dried leaves and roots into powders, mixing them with oils to create paste that smelled earthy and pungent. These concoctions were rubbed onto Emily's legs, followed by long stretches where the boy placed his hands gently on her skin, closing his eyes as if listening for something beneath the surface. At first, Arthur thought it was all theatrics, a performance designed to build trust or perhaps even manipulate. But then came the whispers. The boy would lean close to Emily, speaking softly in a language Arthur didn't recognize. It wasn't English nor any foreign tongue Arthur had heard before. Yet Emily listened intently, nodding occasionally as if understanding every word. When Arthur asked what the boy was saying, Emily simply smiled and replied, "He's telling my legs to wake up." Arthur wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but he couldn't ignore the subtle changes in Emily. Her physical therapist, Mrs. Dawson, noticed them too. During one of their regular sessions, she paused mid-exercise, frowning slightly as she tested Emily's reflexes. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, glancing at him over her glasses. "Have you started her on a new treatment?" Arthur hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Why do you ask?" he countered cautiously. Mrs. Dawson gestured toward Emily's feet. "Look at this. Her toes are moving more than they were last month. And her muscle tone, it's improving. Have you been doing additional therapies I don't know about?" Arthur glanced at the boy who stood quietly in the corner, watching the exchange without comment. "Let's just say we're trying something different," Arthur replied vaguely. Mrs. Dawson raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, she focused on Emily, guiding her through a series of movements. As the session progressed, she grew increasingly intrigued. "Emily?" she said at one point, tapping lightly on her knee. "Can you try pushing against my hand?" To everyone's surprise, Emily managed to exert a tiny bit of pressure, something she hadn't been able to do in months. Her face lit up with joy, and she turned to her father, beaming. "Did you see that, Daddy? I did it." Arthur felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was real hope in Emily's voice. It wasn't just the faint twitch of her toes or the slight improvement in her reflexes. It was the way she carried herself, the spark returning to her eyes. She laughed more often, joked around during therapy, and even teased Arthur about his constant pacing whenever the boy worked with her. But despite these encouraging signs, Arthur's skepticism lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about the boy was off. Who was he really? Where had he learned these techniques? And why did he seem so determined to keep his identity hidden? One evening, after another long day of treatment, Arthur decided to confront him. The boy was sitting alone in the kitchen, sipping a glass of water. His bare feet dangled from the high stool, and for a moment, Arthur almost forgot how extraordinary this child seemed. He looked like any other kid, hungry, tired, and far too young to carry such a heavy burden. "All right," Arthur began, pulling out a chair across from him. "I need answers. Who are you? Where did you come from? And why are you helping us?" The boy set down his glass and met Arthur's gaze steadily. "You won't believe me if I tell you," he said simply. "Try me." The boy sighed as if weighing his options. Finally, he spoke. "I don't belong here, not fully anyway. My grandmother raised me in a place where people still remember the old ways most of the world has forgotten. She taught me everything she knew before she passed away. After that, I traveled, helping whoever needed it. That's all there is to it." Arthur frowned. "That doesn't explain how you ended up outside my gate." "I saw your flyer," the boy replied, "and I felt drawn to it, like it was meant to happen." "Meant to happen?" Arthur echoed incredulously. "You expect me to believe this is some kind of destiny?" The boy shrugged. "Call it what you want. All I know is that Emily needs help and I can give it to her. Arthur leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This conversation was going nowhere. The boy's answers were cryptic, almost evasive, yet there was an honesty in his voice that Arthur couldn't dismiss outright. Still, the nagging doubts refused to leave him alone. Over the next few days, Arthur found himself paying closer attention to the boy's interactions with Emily. There was a gentleness in the way he handled her, a patience that went beyond his years. He never raised his voice, never showed frustration, even when progress seemed painfully slow. Instead, he encouraged Emily with soft words and steady reassurance, treating her not as a patient but as a partner in her own recovery. "You're doing great," he told her one afternoon as she struggled to lift her leg slightly off the therapy mat. "Feel the strength building inside you. Trust yourself." Emily nodded, her brow furrowed with concentration. Slowly, painstakingly, she managed to raise her leg a fraction higher. A triumphant grin spread across her face. "I did it," she exclaimed, clapping her hands. "You sure did," the boy said, smiling warmly. "See? Your body remembers how to move, you just have to remind it." Arthur watched from the doorway, torn between awe and disbelief. Was this real? Or was it all in Emily's head, a placebo effect fueled by the boy's charisma? He couldn't decide. But one thing was certain: Emily was changing, not just physically but emotionally too. She laughed more, talked more, and even started drawing pictures again, something she hadn't done since the accident. As the weeks passed, Emily's progress became harder to ignore. One morning, during a particularly intense session, Mrs. Dawson gasped audibly. "Emily," she said, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Did you feel that?" Emily blinked, looking confused. "Feel what?" "Your foot moved, on its own." Arthur rushed forward, his heart pounding. Sure enough, Emily's right foot had shifted slightly, curling upward as if testing its range of motion. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at her leg in wonder. "Daddy, did you see that?" she whispered. Arthur knelt beside her, gripping her hand tightly. "I saw it, sweetheart. I saw it." For the first time in months, Arthur allowed himself to feel a flicker of genuine hope. Maybe, just maybe, this boy really could help Emily walk again. But as the days went on, the boy grew quieter, more withdrawn. Arthur noticed it during their sessions. The boy's usual confidence seemed to waver, replaced by a distant sadness. One evening after Emily had gone to bed, Arthur found him standing on the balcony, gazing out at the city lights. "What's wrong?" Arthur asked, joining him. The boy didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "They're coming for me," he said. "Who's coming?" Arthur pressed, alarm rising in his chest. The boy shook his head. "It doesn't matter, just promise me one thing." "What?" "When the time comes, don't tell anyone what happened here. Some miracles aren't meant to be shared." Before Arthur could respond, the boy turned and walked back inside, leaving him alone with his thoughts. For the first time, Arthur realized that this journey wasn't just about Emily. It was about faith, trust, and the mysterious forces that connected them all. And as he stood there under the stars, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening in his home was far bigger than he could comprehend. Word spreads faster than fire in a dry forest. No matter how hard Arthur tried to keep things quiet, whispers about the miracle boy began leaking out. It started innocently enough, a neighbor spotting the scruffy child entering the mansion, a curious staff member mentioning something unusual to a friend. But soon those murmurs turned into rumors, and the rumors grew louder until they reached the ears of people who had no business knowing. It was a slow news week when the story broke. A tabloid published an explosive headline: "Billionaire pays homeless charlatan to cure paralyzed daughter." The article painted Arthur as a desperate fool, throwing money at a street kid with wild claims. Photos accompanied the piece, blurry, shots of the boy leaving the mansion, his face partially obscured but recognizable enough to fuel speculation. There were quotes from so-called experts calling the whole thing a scam, doctors warning parents not to trust untested methods, and even anonymous sources claiming Emily's progress was nothing more than a publicity stunt. Arthur woke up to a barrage of calls and messages. His phone buzzed nonstop, each notification bringing another wave of outrage or disbelief. Investors demanded explanations, threatening to pull funding if the scandal wasn't addressed immediately. Friends he thought he could count on distanced themselves, unsure whether associating with him would tarnish their own reputations. Even Mrs. Dawson, Emily's physical therapist, hesitated during her next session, asking cautiously if she should continue working under these circumstances. The pressure mounted daily. Reporters camped outside the gates of the mansion, shouting questions whenever someone left or entered. Cameras flashed like lightning, capturing every movement. Emily, now aware of the chaos swirling around her, became quieter again, retreating into herself. She stopped laughing during therapy sessions, her earlier excitement replaced by confusion and fear. "Why are they mad at us, Daddy?" she asked one evening, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. "Are we doing something wrong?" Arthur knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No, sweetheart," he said firmly, though his voice shook slightly. "We're not doing anything wrong. People just don't understand." But deep down, Arthur wasn't sure he believed his own words. Doubt gnawed at him constantly. Was he being reckless? Had he let desperation cloud his judgment? What if the world was right, and this boy truly was a fraud? The boy himself seemed unfazed by the storm brewing around them. He continued his treatments with unwavering focus, never once acknowledging the media circus outside. If anything, he worked harder, spending longer hours with Emily and pushing her gently but firmly toward milestones she'd never thought possible. One afternoon, while guiding her through a visualization exercise, he paused and looked directly at Arthur. "They can't hurt her unless you let them," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" Arthur asked, his tone sharp with frustration. "I mean," the boy replied, meeting his gaze steadily, "that what happens here, in this room between you and her, is sacred. Don't let their noise take that away." Arthur wanted to argue, to demand answers about who they were and why everyone suddenly cared so much about his family's private life. But before he could speak, Emily called out softly, "I'm ready." The boy nodded and returned to her side, resuming the session as if nothing had happened. Watching him, Arthur felt a strange mix of anger and admiration. How could someone so young remain so calm in the face of such hostility? And why did it feel like the boy knew more than he was letting on? Despite the backlash, Emily's progress continued. Her movements grew stronger, more deliberate. She could lift her legs higher during exercises, and her balance improved significantly. One day, during a particularly grueling session, she managed to stand for a few seconds, gripping the parallel bars tightly, while tears streamed down her face. "I'm standing, Daddy," she cried, her voice trembling with joy. "I'm really standing." Arthur rushed to her side, steadying her as she wobbled precariously. For a moment, all the doubts and fears melted away, replaced by pure elation. This was real. Emily was getting better. Not because of modern medicine or expensive treatments, but because of something far greater, something he couldn't explain. Yet even in the midst of celebration, the boy remained somber. After helping Emily sit back down, he took Arthur aside and spoke in a low voice. "You need to choose, sir," he said urgently. "Your world or hers." "My world?" Arthur repeated, frowning. "What are you talking about?" "The world out there," the boy gestured toward the windows, where reporters still lingered like vultures. "That world will never accept what's happening here. They'll try to tear it apart to make you doubt yourself. But Emily doesn't belong to that world anymore. She belongs to something bigger. You have to decide which side you're on." Arthur stared at him, his mind racing. The boy's words echoed in his head, stirring emotions he didn't know how to process. On one hand, there was the life he'd built, the wealth, the power, the respect. On the other, there was Emily, glowing with newfound strength and hope. Could he really walk away from everything he'd worked for? And if he did, would it be worth it? Before Arthur could respond, the boy turned and walked out of the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. That night, Arthur sat by Emily's bedside, watching her sleep. Her breathing was steady, peaceful, and for the first time in years she looked truly happy. He realized then that the choice wasn't as complicated as it seemed. Whatever happened next, he would protect her, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. By the following week, the media frenzy had reached a fever pitch. Protesters gathered outside the mansion, holding signs that read, "Stop exploiting disabled children," and "Miracles don't come cheap." Arthur ignored them, barricading himself and Emily inside the house. He canceled meetings, avoided calls, and focused solely on supporting his daughter. The boy, meanwhile, worked tirelessly, guiding Emily through increasingly challenging exercises. One morning, as the sun rose over the city, Emily stood shakily, holding onto the parallel bars with both hands. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she refused to give up. "I can do it, Daddy," she whispered, her voice filled with determination. "Just a little longer." Arthur stood behind her, ready to catch her if she fell. The boy watched silently from the corner, his expression unreadable. Slowly, painstakingly, Emily took a step forward, then another, and another. With each step, her confidence grew, until finally she let go of the bars entirely and stood on her own, swaying slightly but upright. Tears streamed down Arthur's face as he clapped and cheered. "You did it, sweetheart, you're walking." Emily laughed, a sound so pure and joyful it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. She turned to the boy, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply. The boy smiled faintly, but there was sadness in his eyes. "You did it yourself," he replied. "I just helped you remember." Later that evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Arthur searched the mansion for the boy. He found him packing his few belongings into the same tattered pouch he'd arrived with. "Where are you going?" Arthur asked, panic rising in his chest. "It's time," the boy said, slinging the pouch over his shoulder. "She doesn't need me anymore." "But we owe you everything," Arthur stammered. "Stay, please." The boy shook his head. "This isn't my place. Besides, staying would only make things worse for all of us." Arthur reached out, gripping the boy's arm. "At least tell me your name. Who are you, really?" The boy hesitated, then smiled softly. "Just a traveler passing through. That's all you need to know." And with that, he slipped out the door, disappearing into the night. Arthur ran after him, but by the time he reached the gate, the boy was gone, leaving behind only footprints in the snow. The days that followed the boy's disappearance were a whirlwind of emotions for Arthur and Emily. The mansion, once buzzing with activity and hope, now felt eerily quiet without the boy's presence. Arthur found himself pacing the halls late, at night, replaying every moment they'd shared. The boy's calm demeanor, his cryptic words, and the way he seemed to carry an aura of mystery that defied explanation. Emily, on the other hand, was adjusting to her newfound ability to walk again. She practiced tirelessly in the therapy room, using the parallel bars and taking small, wobbly steps across the floor. Her laughter had returned, brighter and more infectious than ever, but there was also a lingering sadness in her eyes whenever she mentioned the boy. "Do you think he'll come back?" Emily asked one evening as she sat curled up on the couch clutching her stuffed rabbit. Arthur sighed, sitting beside her and placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we'll always remember what he did for us." Emily nodded silently, staring out the window where the snow still blanketed the ground. It was as if the boy had left behind not just footprints but an imprint on their lives that neither of them could ignore. Meanwhile, the media frenzy outside showed no signs of dying down. If anything, it intensified after Emily's miraculous recovery became public knowledge. Reporters camped outside the gates day and night, desperate for a glimpse of the girl who had defied medical science. Arthur had tried to shield Emily from the chaos, keeping her away from interviews and photo ops, but the pressure to address the situation was mounting. His investors demanded transparency, threatening to sever ties if he didn't provide answers. Friends and acquaintances called incessantly, some offering support, others questioning his sanity. "You're playing with fire," one longtime business partner warned during a tense phone call. "If this blows up, it won't just be your reputation on the line, it'll be the entire company." Arthur clenched his jaw, gripping the phone tightly. "I'm not doing this for publicity or profit," he snapped. "My daughter is walking." "Again, because of something I can't explain, isn't that enough?" "It's not about what's enough," the man replied coldly. "It's about perception. People are calling you gullible, reckless, even dangerous. You need to control the narrative before it ruins everything." Arthur ended the call abruptly, slamming the phone onto the desk. He hated the way everyone wanted to dissect and analyze what had happened, reducing it to sound bites and headlines. To them it was a story, a scandal worth debating. But to him and Emily, it was so much more. It was life-changing. It was sacred. Determined to take back control, Arthur made a bold decision. He announced a press conference, inviting journalists and skeptics alike to hear directly from him and Emily. The event would coincide with Emily's annual charity gala, a fundraiser for children with spinal injuries that Arthur had organized months ago. This time, however, the focus wouldn't be on raising money. It would be on sharing hope. On the night of the gala, the ballroom buzzed with anticipation. Hundreds of guests filled the space, dressed in elegant gowns and tailored suits. Cameras flashed as Arthur stepped onto the stage holding Emily's hand. She wore a bright pink dress, her wheelchair pushed aside for the occasion. The crowd erupted into applause, but Arthur raised a hand to silence them. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves churning in his stomach. "Tonight, I want to share something truly extraordinary, not just with you, but with the world." He turned to Emily, smiling warmly. "This is my daughter. Just over a year ago, she was paralyzed from the waist down after a car accident. An accident I caused." Gasps rippled through the audience, but Arthur pressed on. No amount of money, no doctor, no treatment could undo the damage. We were told she'd never walk again. Emily stepped forward, gripping the microphone with both hands. Her voice trembled slightly, but her courage shone through. "But then, someone helped me. Someone who believed I could walk again, even when no one else did." Arthur watched as tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, standing tall. "He said I was stronger than I thought, and he was right." The crowd erupted into cheers, many people rising to their feet. Arthur wrapped an arm around Emily, pulling her close. For a brief moment the noise faded, and all he could hear was the sound of her breathing, steady, alive, full of promise. As the applause continued, Arthur leaned down to whisper in her ear, "Are you ready?" She nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. Together they stepped away from the podium and walked slowly toward the center of the stage. Each step was deliberate, measured, as if Emily were proving to herself and the world that she could do it. The room fell silent save for a few gasps and murmurs. When they reached the middle of the stage, Arthur stopped and turned to face the audience. "This is my miracle," he said simply, gesturing to Emily. "Not because she's walking again, but because she reminded me what really matters. Faith, hope, love." The crowd erupted once more, this time louder and longer. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing every angle of Emily standing proudly beside her father. But amidst the chaos, Arthur couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. The boy wasn't here to witness this moment, to see the impact of what he'd done. Without him, none of this would have been possible. After the gala, Arthur retreated to his study, exhausted but relieved. The weight of secrecy had lifted, replaced by a sense of clarity. He poured himself a drink and sank into his chair, staring at the empty fireplace. On the desk lay a package delivered earlier that day, a thick envelope containing documents from a private investigator he'd hired weeks ago. Curious, he opened it and began reading. The report was sparse, almost frustratingly so. The boy's fingerprints matched no databases, and his name appeared nowhere in official records. There were no birth certificates, school enrollments, or family histories. It was as if he didn't exist. But tucked inside the envelope was a faded photograph of a young boy standing beside an elderly woman. The resemblance was unmistakable. It was the same child who had entered Arthur's life months ago. On the back of the photo, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Ethan, taken too soon." Arthur's heart sank. According to the investigator, the boy in the photo had died in a house fire over a decade ago. Yet, there was no doubt in Arthur's mind that the child in the picture was the same one who had healed Emily. How was it possible? Was it some kind of divine intervention? Or had the boy been sent back for a purpose? Tears blurred Arthur's vision as he stared at the photo. He realized then that the boy, Ethan, hadn't been an ordinary person. Maybe he never was. Whatever he was, wherever he came from, he had given Arthur and Emily a gift beyond measure, a second chance. The next morning, Arthur visited Emily's room to find her drawing pictures at her desk. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "Daddy, look," she said excitedly, holding up a sketch of two figures holding hands, one tall, one short. Behind them was a figure with wings watching over them. "That's beautiful," Arthur said, kneeling beside her. "Who's that in the back?" Emily grinned mischievously. "That's Ethan. He's our angel." Arthur chuckled softly, ruffling her hair. "Yeah, sweetheart, he sure is." For the first time in years, Arthur felt at peace. The questions may never be answered, and the skepticism might never fade. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the love between him and Emily, and the memory of a boy who had changed their lives forever. Months passed after the gala, and life began to settle into a new rhythm for Arthur and Emily. The media storm eventually died down, though whispers of their story lingered in tabloids and online forums. Some praised Emily's recovery as a beacon of hope. Others dismissed it as an elaborate hoax. But none of that mattered to Arthur anymore. What mattered was the laughter echoing through the halls of their home once again. The sound of Emily running, jumping, and dancing like any other child her age. Emily had fully embraced her mobility, testing the limits of her body with the boundless energy only a child could possess. She chased butterflies in the garden, practiced cartwheels on the lawn, and even convinced Arthur to join her in clumsy attempts at skipping rope. Watching her, Arthur felt a warmth he hadn't known in years, a deep, unshakable gratitude for the second chance they'd been given. Yet there were still moments when the absence of the boy weighed heavily on him. One rainy afternoon, while Emily played indoors, Arthur found himself standing in front of the framed note Ethan had left behind. The words, "You needed to believe in something bigger than money. She did all the work." Were simple but profound. They reminded Arthur of how far he'd come, not just financially or professionally, but emotionally. Before Emily's accident, he'd been consumed by ambition, chasing success at the expense of everything else. Now he realized that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or deals. It was measured in moments shared, in love given freely, and in faith held steadfastly. Determined to honor Ethan's memory, Arthur made a decision that shocked everyone around him. He liquidated his assets, his companies, properties, and investments, and poured the proceeds into building clinics across the country. These weren't ordinary medical facilities. They combined cutting-edge science with holistic therapies inspired by what Arthur had witnessed during those weeks with Ethan. Physical therapists worked alongside practitioners of alternative medicine, creating programs tailored to each patient's unique needs. The clinics became sanctuaries of healing, places where families facing unimaginable challenges could find hope. Arthur named the initiative the Quiet Angel Project, a nod to the mysterious boy who had changed their lives. When reporters asked why he chose such an unconventional name, Arthur simply smiled and said, "Because sometimes miracles don't announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they arrive quietly, leaving footprints in the snow." Years went by and Emily grew into a bright, confident young woman. Her childhood memories of Ethan remained vivid, though she rarely spoke about him except to close friends. To her, he was more than just a person. He was a symbol of belief, of possibility, of light in the darkest times. As she entered adulthood, she often wondered if she'd ever meet someone like him again. Someone who saw potential where others saw limitations. Someone who believed in magic when logic failed. One evening, during a rare visit home from college, Emily sat with Arthur in the living room, flipping through old photo albums. They came across a picture of her standing on stage at the gala, holding Arthur's hand. Tears welled up in her eyes as she traced the image with her finger. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" she asked softly. Arthur hesitated before answering. "I don't know, sweetheart, but part of me thinks we already have, in every person we've helped through the clinics. Maybe that's how it works. Maybe he moves from one life to another, helping people when they need it most." Emily nodded thoughtfully, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars against the night sky. For a moment, she imagined Ethan standing somewhere among them, watching over her and her father, ensuring they stayed true to the path they'd chosen. Decades later, when Arthur was an old man with silver hair and a heart full of stories, he often found himself sitting on the balcony of his modest apartment, staring at the same city skyline he'd admired all those years ago. Life had taken many turns since the day Ethan walked into their lives, but one thing remained constant: the lessons he'd learned about faith, humility, and the power of believing in something greater than oneself. Journalists occasionally sought him out, eager to hear the tale of the miracle boy who had vanished as mysteriously as he'd appeared. One particularly persistent reporter cornered Arthur at a charity event, asking point blank if he regretted letting Ethan go. "Regret?" Arthur chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "No, I don't regret it. He gave us exactly what we needed. A reminder that sometimes the impossible is just waiting for us to believe in it." The reporter scribbled furiously in her notebook, then hesitated before posing her final question. "Do you think he was supernatural? A ghost, maybe?" Arthur smiled, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "What do you think?" The reporter laughed nervously, unsure whether he was teasing her or hinting at something deeper. Whatever the truth was, Arthur kept it to himself, content to let the mystery remain unsolved. In time, rumors began to surface, not about Ethan's past, but about sightings of a barefoot teenager near hospitals and rehabilitation centers. Patients claimed to see him wandering the halls late at night, speaking softly to those who seemed lost or broken. Some described him as a healer, while others called him a guardian angel. No one could agree on his appearance or confirm his presence, yet the stories persisted, spreading like whispers among those who dared to believe in miracles. One chilly winter evening, years after Arthur's passing, a young mother sat beside her son's hospital bed, clutching his frail hand. The boy had been in a coma for weeks following a severe illness, and doctors had begun preparing her for the worst. Exhausted and heartbroken, she prayed silently, begging for a sign that her son would pull through. As she wiped away her tears, a voice broke the silence. "He's stronger than you think," it said gently. Startled, the woman turned to see a teenage boy standing in the doorway, his face smudged with dirt and his clothes patched together like scraps of old blankets. His eyes, sharp and piercing, seemed to see right through her. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The boy stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Someone who knows your son can wake up," he replied confidently. "But you have to believe it first." And with that, he disappeared into the hallway, leaving the woman staring after him in stunned silence. Moments later, her son stirred, his eyelids fluttering open as he gazed up at her with a sleepy smile. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the ground in a fresh layer of white. Somewhere in the distance, faint footprints marked the pavement, leading toward the horizon.